Backpacked 200 miles with my family, including my 2-year-old, in order to find out what it's like about bugging out and what it would really be like in a real SHTF scenario so that you could learn a little bit more from what I learned from that process too. At the point of recording this video, there are 88 subscribers, so go ahead and subscribe too because I think I bring some other insights into this space for emergency preparedness so you can get a little bit of understanding of where my perspective comes from, as well as different gear lists and other fun things in emergency preparedness. But for this particular video, I'm going to talk a little bit more about what it was like to walk 200 miles with my family, and I was able to come up with a lot of ideas on what it would be like for bugging out with a family, because a lot of times people are putting together different bags and different scenarios and preparing for this, and they're not really thinking about what it would really be like to do it with their entire family. And I do want to preface this entire video by saying that I don't actually think that bugging out is a great idea, and I think I'll share some of that perspective. And a lot of people will be like, yeah, of course it's the last scenario, but people prepare for it in a very different way than I think is reasonable, and it is probably the last thing that you want to even think about. I did have pushback one time that I thought was very fair when people were saying bugging out. I think what they meant was just having an emergency bag to be able to evade something like a hurricane. But in those scenarios, I would probably argue that there is enough time and warning just to put together some type of emergency bag, like clothes and different things that you may need for that specific scenario, because you do have weather channels and you can plan for that. I'm talking about like really terrible scenarios that would be grid down, you've exhausted all of your food and water supply, just everything. And obviously you're going to want to build up all that supply first, but what would it be like if you did have to bug out, including with a family? And you could have young children, or you could have teenagers, or whoever that may be. In my scenario, my bug out location would be my parents' property because they're about 50 acres, about 200 miles away. So my backpacking trip mimicked what that bug out scenario would look like. So that's why I'm decided to pick that specific number of miles, because it's most similar to my scenario. But if your bug out location is beyond that, then think about what that would look like for you. Now, when I decided to backpack 200 miles, what we ended up doing was walking the Camino de Santiago in Spain and Portugal, and we walked about 200 miles as a family. And we did have backpacks, and we did walk every single day until we hit that location. But I did learn a lot about what it's like as a family. And one of the things I noticed that a lot of people aren't planning for about is what would you actually use to be able to carry all the gear? And in our case, we had a jogger stroller, but if you're really bugging out, you'd probably have a bike, and you probably have a bike buggy as their primary way to get to your bug out location. Those would be the primary things that I would start with. Now, someone may counter and say, well, the roads are going to be blocked and whatever, and probably, but I've also been able to carry a stroller. There were places along this particular path where it wasn't along roads, it was along, bike paths. There was some roads, but there was some. There's actually Roman roads, which are big boulders, and we had to take all our gear, put it on our back, and then figure out a way to get through. So even with a bike, you can lift a bike and get over the boulders and more rough terrain, but you are going to default to roads or paths of some types that are probably accessible via something with a larger tire. So if you're planning a bug out scenario, I don't know why people are thinking about backpacking all their gear. They shouldn't. I mean, obviously, you start with your vehicle, and if that's not accessible, then you go to a bike and a bike buggy. And if that's not accessible, then you should probably get yourself a jogger stroller in addition to your backpack. And that would be my progression of thoughts. And if you're thinking about how to do that, start by prepping that gear. And to be honest, the bike and bike buggy would be really great for different scenarios for bugging in as well. So it's a duplicate use case. If you had to go and get water from a nearby stream or a retention pond for providing water for your family and you're going to filter it, my use case is like 3 blocks away. But if you've ever carried that much water before, you probably want a bike and a bike buggy to be able to walk at that distance on a daily basis. So I do want to state that I don't think that there's really any true reason why you would just be bugging out with just a backpack. So one of the first takeaways from walking 200 miles with my family was that I wouldn't just have a backpack and backpacking gear. I would have other types of methods to be able to carry my gear further and to carry more gear. And that would be the number one thing that you should be thinking about. And most people do have a bike. The second thing to think about is that if you do have toddlers or young kids, and if you've ever traveled to just normal vacations for a weekend trip, you probably know that instead of carrying one duffel bag for a weekend, you're carrying like 5 times that amount, and it fills up your entire car. And so bugging out would probably be a very similar use case there. And in that scenario, if you do have young kids, you're going to have to carry a lot of gear. And again, you're not going to fit it all into a backpacking setup. You're going to be able to need that additional method to carry that. And you're not going to want to push a wheelbarrow or anything like that. You're going to want a bike buggy, or a stroller. But luckily, you probably have a stroller if you have young kids. But then just make sure that you have a tire stroller versus something with the smaller wheels. Now, along with that topic, there were flat tires along that trip. And so we did have to carry a pump, a small portable pump. We also had to carry some other things like an inner tire, practice replacing those out, and get different types of ways to fix the tire in case there's a puncture. So if you were trying to plan for this bug out scenario that is very unlikely, you would also want to have a way to repair those tires. If you're someone who does like to prep for different scenarios like bugging out, then I would probably recommend that you just practice with backpacking and do long distance backpacking. That would be the best way to prepare your body and to get experience from doing long distance treks. I've done 2 treks. I've done that 200-mile with my family, but I've also done a 500-mile one. And going day after day and learning how that wear and tear on your body is like, I make probably a little bit of a bold statement that if you can walk comfortably 3 miles, you can backpack 15 to 20 miles a day. But you do need to think about what your blister kit. I like to have Leuco tape and actually craft foam, and I go about that in my car emergency kit video. I talk about that as well. But thinking about if you're going to practice for bug out, that you should really just think about what it would be like to go backpacking long distances. And I would encourage you to maybe even do an annual trip where you backpack 50 miles, see what it's like, see how your body just gets exhausted. And you'll start to see what I mean by it not being really realistic to plan for a bug out scenario where you don't have that additional method to carry all the gear you'll need. Because in backpacking already, you're going to have more of a lightweight backpack because you're planning the exact days you need. You're planning water sources every single spot. You're probably not commonly backpacking with like a toddler, or if you did, you'd probably get some practice with how to go more lightweight. But you wouldn't be carrying things backpacking like your firearms and maybe just tons of food. And if you were in a bug out scenario, you would be carrying way more than you need, most likely. You'd be carrying double the amount of food because you're not going to be hunting along the way. Most likely, if you happen to find something great, your bag is going to be quadruple the weight that would be ideal because you're going to be carrying much heavier gear that can handle more extreme weather. You're going to have way more gear because you're taking all the things that you might want for a long-term survival at that new location. So you're taking all of your home setup to that new location. It's not going to be a 30, 40-pound backpack. We're talking about hundreds of pounds worth of gear to be able to transfer from your home location to a bug out location. And that's one of the reasons why I just don't think it's realistic to ever think about bugging out in the first place. Now, there's probably maybe a couple ways to explain what bugging out means for other people. I was talking to Provide and Protect channel and talking about in his scenario, he was hit by hurricanes, and the way he thinks about bugging out is for those more practical use cases. And I 100% agree. I think that those are the things that you should be preparing for and not for society collapse because carrying that amount of gear would be unreasonable. So those are my thoughts on this particular video. I know I rambled a little bit, but hopefully you got some nuggets of information to chew on throughout this video, and you can think about what it would be like if you had to walk with your entire family 200 miles, because I learned a lot from that particular trip too.